For his art of deciphering the Quran, he was famous to distant lands. No one in art compares to him, the reason why they bow before him. Masterpieces of the book art of Mawarannahr are exquisitely decorated with miniatures, as if woven from a lace of calligraphic underscores. Here in the Russian National Library, among the masterpieces of book art copied from 15th to the 17th centuries, there are those made in the famous cities of Uzbekistan. Among the 28,000 Oriental manuscripts, the priceless folios made in Bukhara and Samarkand are also kept. 9 of them were included in the second album of the Russian National Library, published as part of the Cultural Legacy of Uzbekistan in the World Collections project. A scattering of pearls from the sayings of the ruler of the believers Ali. This unique manuscript became the earliest of the Mawarannahr book art monuments, arrived in 1869 in the Russian National Library. It was copied in Samarkand. Almost 3 centuries before it came to St. Petersburg, it was copied by the famous calligrapher Abdullah al-Haravi in the 1357 to 1358. He was called Heratian and Tabba, since he was born in Herat in the family of a cook. It is reliably known that the grandson of Amir Timur, Mirza Ulugh brought the best masters of book art, calligraphers, miniatures, bookbinders to Samarkand from Herat. Perhaps at the time Al-Haravi, who was an apprentice of the famous calligrapher Jafar Tabrizi, moved to Samarkand. Basically, the biography of calligraphers is restored from the colophons of manuscripts. Often we do not know the exact dates when they moved from one place to another, but regarding this calligrapher, it is known that in the 1350s he lived in Samarkand for a long period and created a number of manuscripts there. The manuscript is exquisitely decorated with great taste. In this way, in the 13th, 15th centuries, books for the rulers and nobility were designed. The decor of the book is notable for strict geometric patterns, an abundance of gold and blue paint. The script and embossed leather binding are exceptionally large. The most outstanding design is one of the front pages. The first double-page spread, the richest page of the manuscript, is an ornate carved gate that invites readers to dive into the content. A blue sheet of Russian paper of the 19th century is attached to the manuscript. It says, Kitab-i Makhtum Samarkandi, Book of Samarkand Rulers. They are in Russian from the Tamerlane Library. In the year in which the manuscript is dated 862 AH, Sultan Abu Sayyid, the great-grandson of Amir Timur, ruled in Mawarannahr. It is possible that this masterpiece of manuscript was created in his royal workshop, Kitabkhana. A certain Petrov, who allegedly found it in a Gur Amir, donated it to the library. This is a casket in which precious stones are collected. These are the lines from the most popular works of Persian literature, the Gulistan, the Rose Garden, the author of which is the great poet Mushraf-ed-Din Muslih Saadi. This technique of decorating the binding appeared in the 15th century in Herat. Possibly, the Chinese liqueur art influenced on decorating objects with liqueur, and in the Timurid era, it began gaining popularity and remained in fashion until the 19th century. The Gulistan by Saadi was written in the middle of the 13th century in 1258. This work consists of short stories, the copy of which is kept in the Russian National Library, was later copied in Bukhara. The evidence is the inscription, and the date of their creation in the 1566-1567 is indicated in the miniatures. The Gulistan is a collection of short stories of instructive nature in which prose, often rhymed, is mixed with poetic passages. Written in extremely elegant language, it is considered one of the brightest examples of Persian classical literature. The first miniature illustrates the story of how a certain ruler went on a boat trip on a ship, and he had a slave who had not previously gone to the sea. And he was terribly frightened. He huddled in a corner of a ship, trembling and spoiling everyone's impression of the voyage. The Shah ordered to throw him overboard. The slave began drowning. Then he was dragged onto the deck by hair, and he was already satisfied with safety. He sat on the deck and no longer pestered anyone with his fears, screams, crying, and so on. There's an illustrated story of wrestler and an apprentice. The apprentice thought he had surpassed his master, but then a contest was held in the presence of the ruler, and the old fighter, he was an old stager, did not reveal anything to his student from his tricks and hit him with one of those tricks that were unknown to him. This is exactly the moment depicted there. Each of the masterpieces of book art has its own history and destiny. This copy of Saadi was once in the library of Babur Sultan Jahangir. The evidence is the inscription Radhuran ibn Jahangir Padishah. Researchers believe that the entry was made by Shah Jahan, the heir of the Jahangir, who bore the name Huran before his coronation. This entry was just written by his hand. The Gulistan, in this regard, an essay written in the 13th century, became a model for subsequent authors. And in the same style, for example, the Bakhristan was written, the work by Abdurrahman Jami. That is, imitations of the Gulistan were written later as well, because there is one of the greatest authors who created a work that became a model for future generations. The Gulistan by Saadi was copied in Bukhara for a certain Hoja Kamaluddin, who was a vizier under the Shaybanids. Hoja Kamaluddin, about whom, in principle, nothing is written in historical sources, nevertheless is the person for whom this manuscript was made. And already in the 19th century, this folio was in a small but very valuable collection of Lieutenant General Count Ivan Simonich, who was Russian minister plenipotentiary at the Persian court in 1832-38. In 1864, his heir sold the collection to the Russian Imperial Library. The Tuhfat al-Ahrar, this copy of Abdurrahman Jami, copied in 1650-70 in Bukhara, was among 400 Arabic manuscripts that ended up in the Imperial Public Library between 1827-29, after the Russian, Persian, and Russian-Turkish Wars. The manuscript belongs to the so-called Ardabil collection, and there's a seal of Ardabil Waqf. This inscription is Waqf, a record of the transfer of this manuscript to the tomb of Sheikh Saifuddin, who was the ancestor of founders of Safavid dynasty. He was a Sufi, highly revered. To his tomb in Ardabil was also a revered Azar, and naturally his descendants, the rulers of Iran from the Safavid dynasty, took great care to decorate this place. Beautiful buildings were built there. There was a building called Chinnekhana, that is, buildings where porcelain works, vases, and various other vessels, in particular, also brought from China made in Iran, were kept. Manuscripts were also kept there. At the beginning of the manuscripts, there is a small prose preface saying that the author wrote this poem in imitation to Nizami and Amir Khosrow Dehlavi, followed by a poetic text which was always written in columns in Arabic manuscripts.
Поэма эта была написана Абдуррахманом Джами.
This poem was written by Abdurrahman Jami in 1481-82. Both in form and in content, it is an imitation of Nizami's famous poem, Treasury of Secrets. But Nizami was more of a philosopher, and Jami was a well-known Sufi mystic, so the Sufi nature of the text is clearly expressed here.
Поэтому суфийский характер текста здесь очень ярко выражен.
The manuscript is beautifully designed in a calligraphic nostalgic script and with 3 miniatures. There are sections in which the author touches on the main provisions of Islam, Sufism, and universal wisdom. For example, instructions to people of different ages, the elderly not to behave like young people, and all these arguments are accompanied by stories, parables. One of the illustrated, the parable of the beautiful Yusuf, the biblical Joseph, who received a mirror as a gift from a wanderer from Canaan. The plot of another miniature was based on the Indian fables about animals. The binding style is typical for the late 16th century. It is recognizable. An influence of the Herat school is obvious. According to the authors of the book album, the manuscript presented here are very closely related to the traditions of the book art of Khorasan, as well as the sculpture of India in the reign of great Mughals. The Hamsa by Nizami, copied in 1648 in Bukhara, was presented to the Russian Emperor Alexander II by the great Emir of Bukhara, Muzaffar Khan. A fragment of Iranian fabric made in the 17th century, apparently located in Bukhara and got there as a gift or diplomatic exchange, was used for decoration on the outside of covers. Such beauties in European outfit facing each other were depicted on this fabric.
Расположенные лицом красавицы в европейском наряде.
The copy is decorated with 61 miniatures. These are visible images of the poems Treasury of Secrets, Layli and Majnun, Farhad and Shirin, as well as the Sharafnama, the book of glory about Alexander the Great. Researchers believe that 7 artists work on the miniatures of this manuscript. Some artists are still enigmatic figures. The miniatures created by them are discussed by researchers, and various hypotheses are put forward about their origin. There is still a lot to work on. Because of the format of the manuscript is large, most of the miniatures are small. That is, they do not occupy the entire space of the page, although there are quite large ones. For example, Bahrangur and lions killed by him occupy a significant space, but not the entire page. In 1913, the Emir of Bukhara Alim Khan presented Nicholas II on the occasion of the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty with 20 Persian manuscripts of the 15th, 19th centuries, which had previously been kept in the library of Bukhara rulers. This is the so-called collection of the Emir of Bukhara, which is the same 1913 was transferred to the public library. Among was the poetic collection Bustan Saadi, copied in the late 16th century by the Bukhara court calligrapher Mir Kulangi. This binding is also decorated as you see with lacquer painting, but on the inside, in a slightly different manner, you see leather and the finest leather mesh superimposed over a colored background of gold, blue and turquoise. This manner of decorating manuscripts appeared in the 15th century and was popular in the 16th century.
На самом деле здесь только вот одна пара.
Actually, there is only one pair of miniatures, which is a double front piece at the beginning of the work. There are two couples in love here. It is believed that this is the work by the artist Abdullah, who worked in Bukhara in the late 16th century. The calligrapher who copied his manuscript is also known. We find his name as usual at the end, the famous calligrapher Mir Hussein al-Husseini, known as Mir Kulayangi, who also worked in the Kitabkhana Court Library in a workshop in Bukhara and copied a number of manuscripts. From the collection of the Emir was Hosraf Dekhlawi's poem, Duwal Rani and Hazir Khan of 1598. Its main theme is the love of the characters, Duwal Rani and Hazir Khan. They are real historical figures whom the poet personally knew. Hazir Khan was the son of the Delhi Sultan Al-Yaddin from the Khalji dynasty. So he fell in love with a girl named Duwal Rani, who was the daughter of his father's wife from another marriage. The calligrapher is also famous. Bukhara calligrapher Mir Salih Mir Tahir al-Bukhari, that is, his Nisbah says he was Bukharian. The poem is intertwined with Abdurrahman Jami's famous poem Yusuf and Zulaikha. This is a Shiraz copy from the 16th century. The manuscript is interesting in that it is actually two manuscripts. That is, here is the so-called convolute. The poem of the Herat poet Mahmud Arifi Halnama, copied in 1598, is decorated with miniatures polo game in meeting of the prince and the dervish.
Здесь мы хотели бы как раз обратить внимание на поэму
Here,
Arifi.
we would like to pay attention to Arifi's poem known as The Ball and the Club, or Halnama, that is, a book about ecstasy, the Sufi state of ecstasy. It was copied exactly in Bukhara. Its scribe was Fulad Muhammad al-Bukhari. The author describes the nature of a beautiful spring garden. He walks through its garden, listens to the allegorical dispute between heaven and earth. And then, this garden is filled with horse polo players, and this moment is just depicted here. This copy entered the public library in 1871 among 1907 manuscripts brought from Shahrisabz. Among them were books in Arabic, Old Uzbek, and Chagatai, but mostly in Persian. This manuscript previously belonged to Muhammad Mukhimi, who had a personal library. It remains unclear where Abul Qasim Firdausi's folio Shahnameh came to the Russian library. The Book of Kings is an outstanding epic work on which Firdausi worked 35 years. This list was copied in 1602-03 by the calligrapher Mirza Muhammad Aziz al-Bukhari. It's no older than all the previous ones, since we're moving in chronological order, but it is just destroyed the moss from moisture, so most of the miniatures have a shabby appearance. Some of the paint has crumbled, some were intentionally damaged, the faces of the characters were scratched. 23 miniatures adorn this volume, some of which have not been spared by time. Each of the miniatures illustrates stories about kings of legendary dynasties. The book album Book Art of Mawarannahr also includes miniatures from the Kulliyat by Nizamuddin Ali Sher Nawai, the great Uzbek poet, philanthropist, and statesman who left behind a huge poetic legacy. The Kulliyat is a collection of works, but this copy is not complete. Presumably, it was copied in Herat in the late 15th, early 16th century. Miniatures, there are 25 of them, were created later in the 1520s. They illustrate poems from the famous works by Alisher Nawai. The manuscript arrived in the public library in 1817. The illustrated manuscripts of Mawarannahr are exquisite, filled with the wisdom of centuries and unforgettable images. Each of them is a masterpiece of book art that has preserved for us the great heritage of the past. It is the cultural legacy of Uzbekistan in the World Collections Project. I am Shaknal Zaganieva. Thank you for your attention.